Right now, if the weather gets too hot, you press a button on your wall and cold air blows into your room. If it rains, you stay inside. If you live near the coast and hear a storm is coming, you watch it on a radar map, pack your car, and drive inland on a paved highway. When we think about climate change today, we think of it as a modern crisis. We think of carbon emissions, rising sea levels, and the fear that our world is going to fundamentally change. And we panic because we think we are the first human beings to ever face a planet that is turning against us. But you are not the first. You are the descendant of people who lived through the end of the world, over and over again. Imagine waking up roughly 74,000 years ago. You live in what is now Indonesia, or maybe India, or even East Africa. It's a normal day. You are tracking an animal. You are looking for water. And then a sound tears through the earth so loud it ruptures the eardrums of animals hundreds of miles away. The ground violently shakes. And when you look up at the horizon, the sky is turning black. Not storm cloud black. A dense, suffocating wall of ash that rises into the stratosphere and blocks out the sun. This was the Mount Toba eruption. It was the largest volcanic explosion in the last 2 million years. It blew thousands of cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The ash cloud spread across the entire planet, and then the temperature dropped. A volcanic winter set in. For years, the sun was a pale ghost in a gray sky. Plant life withered, herbivores starved, predators starved, and humans who had spent hundreds of thousands of years slowly expanding across the globe started dying. According to the genetic bottleneck theory, human populations plummeted. Some scientists believe that during this period, the total number of human beings alive on planet Earth shrank to as few as 3 to 10,000 breeding pairs. That is less than the population of a small modern town. Every single one of the 8 billion people alive today is descended from that tiny, desperate group of survivors. They didn't have emergency supplies. They didn't have agriculture. They just had a world that suddenly got dark, cold, and dead. But they survived. They adapted their hunting strategies, they clung to the coasts, they learned to eat shellfish and marine life when the inland forests turned to dust. The climate tried to erase them, and they refused to leave. But Toba was a sudden catastrophe. What happens when the change is slow, creeping, and impossible to fight? Fast forward to about 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age. If you lived in Northern Europe or North America, you weren't dealing with a few extra snow days. You were dealing with ice sheets that were 2 miles thick. The global temperature was about 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is today. And yet, humans were there. When you live in a world where the ground is frozen solid and trees simply do not grow, you can't build a log cabin. You can't just weave some grass together. So what do? You look at the biggest, deadliest animal on the tundra, and you build a house out of its skeleton. In a place called Mezhirich in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists found massive circular structures built entirely out of mammoth bones. We are talking about hundreds of bones, interlocking jaws, curved tusks perfectly arranged to form a dome, which was then covered in animal hides to keep the freezing wind out. A single mammoth skull weighs over 200 pounds. These people were hunting 4-ton ice elephants with sharp rocks, dragging their skeletons back through the snow, and doing architectural engineering with them. And inside those bone houses, they sat by the fire and did something else. They invented. You can't survive an ice age with just a fire. You need clothes that fit perfectly to trap your body heat. And to do that, you need a needle. Archaeologists have found bone needles with tiny drilled eyes dating back over 20,000 years. Our ancestors invented tailored clothing because the climate forced them to. The cold didn't just make them tough, it made them tailors, architects, and engineers. But cold is just one way the planet changes. What happens when it gets hot? Deep in the Sahara Desert, in a place called the Gilf Kebir in southwestern Egypt, there is a cave. It sits in one of the most brutal, bone-dry, unforgiving landscapes on Earth. A place where absolutely nothing grows and there is no surface water for hundreds of miles. But if you walk into this cave and look at the walls, you will see rock art painted by human hands thousands of years ago. The paintings show lions, gazelles, and ostriches. And then, there is something impossible. There are paintings of people swimming. It's called the Cave of Swimmers. And it's not a metaphor. About 10,000 years ago, the Earth's orbit was tilted slightly differently. That slight tilt shifted the global monsoon patterns. And for a few thousand years, the Sahara wasn't a desert at all. It was a lush green savanna. It was a paradise. There were massive lakes, rivers, hippos, and crocodiles. And human beings lived there. They hunted, they swam, they built communities. But then the Earth's orbit slowly shifted back. The rain stopped coming. The lakes started shrinking. The grass turned brown. The sand took over. Imagine watching your world slowly die. Imagine the stories the elders told. When I was a boy, there was a lake here, and then one day it was just dust. They couldn't stay. So they packed whatever they could carry and they walked. They followed the receding water east until they hit a massive, permanent river, the Nile. The drying of the Sahara forced thousands of nomadic humans to crowd into the Nile River Valley. That overcrowding, that concentration of human brilliance and desperation, led to the invention of new farming techniques, complex social structures, and eventually, the rise of ancient Egypt. Climate change didn't just destroy the Green Sahara, it built the pyramids. But while the people in Africa were dealing with a world that was drying up, the people in Northern Europe were dealing with the exact opposite. When the Ice Age ended, all that 2-mile thick ice had to go somewhere. It melted, and as it melted, global sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet. Today, if you look at a map of Europe, there is a body of water separating Great Britain from the rest of the continent called the North Sea. But 10,000 years ago, there was no sea there. It was a massive rolling plain of land called Doggerland. Doggerland was the prime real estate of the ancient world. It was a hunter's paradise full of lagoons, marshes, deer, and wild boar. Thousands of human beings lived there. But generation by generation, the water crept higher. It wasn't a flood that happened overnight. It was a slow, agonizing loss of territory. A beach where you used to camp was suddenly underwater. A marsh where you hunted birds was swallowed by the tide. Over thousands of years, Doggerland shrank from a massive continent-connecting land bridge to an island. And then, around 8,200 years ago, the final blow came. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga triggered a tsunami. A wall of water estimated to be up to 60 feet high raced across the ocean and completely swallowed whatever was left of Doggerland. Everyone and everything that was still there was wiped off the face of the earth. Today, modern fishermen in the North Sea still pull up ancient stone tools and mammoth bones in their nets, the only remains of a lost world sitting at the bottom of the ocean. The survivors, the ones who had already moved to higher ground in what is now Britain and the Netherlands, had to start over. They had to learn how to fish in deeper waters, how to build better boats, how to survive on a completely different map. When you look at human history, you see a species that is constantly being pushed to the edge of extinction by a planet that cannot make up its mind. Volcanic winters, mile-thick ice, deserts turning to grasslands and back to deserts, oceans swallowing entire countries. Ancient humans didn't have satellites to warn them. They didn't have government relief funds or emergency shelters. They only had their brains, their hands, and the people sitting next to them around the fire. When the cold came, they built houses out of monsters and invented clothes. When the lakes dried up, they walked across continents and built empires. When the oceans rose, they built boats and learned to sail. We talk about climate change today as if it is the final chapter of the human story. We look at the rising sea levels and the changing weather, and we feel a deep, terrifying paralysis. But boredom didn't exist for your ancestors, and neither did giving up. Every time the sky darkened, every time the ice expanded, every time the water rose, humanity didn't just survive. We leveled up. We invented new technologies, formed new societies, and pushed into territories no human had ever seen. The struggle against a changing planet isn't just something that happened to us. It is the very thing that made us human. So the next time you hear the rain hammering against your window, or you step outside into the bitter cold, remember that you carry the exact same DNA as the people who watched the Ice Age melt and the Sahara dry. You are the product of 300,000 years of survivors, and they never stopped walking.